Okay, we just finished going through the first part to the 2018 question for ArrayTester, and now we're going to go ahead and take a look at how to answer part B, which is writing the method for isLatin. Now, before we can go ahead and write this method, we want to make sure we fully understand these two helper methods that are available to us, has all values and contains duplicates. Now, one thing you'll understand about the AP is that if they give you methods to use, they want you to use them. They want to see that you understand how to make use of tools that are available to you and that you don't reinvent the wheel, okay? Even if they don't tell you that you have to use them, in many cases you will be penalized if you write a solution that does not use them. So our first method that we have to our use is has all values. And this method will return true if and only if every value in the first array appears in the second array. Now notice that these parameters are one-dimensional arrays. So that means that you can pass a row or a column, but you cannot pass a 2D array. And this is important to mention because you cannot just send the entire array 2D to this method. You have to strip off one array at a time, either a single row or a single column. Now, luckily, we just wrote a method called getColumn, which will allow us to strip off a column, and we can send in a whole row at a time. So we have the ability to call this method and send it each row and each column in order to check. Secondly, our next helper method is why do I keep saying complaints? Probably because my kids have been complaining all day about e-learning. Okay, contains duplicates. So this contains duplicates method, what this is going to do is check to see if the given array, again, single dimension array, whether it's a row or a column, does not matter, if this one-dimensional array has any duplicate values. If there are any duplicate values, it's going to return true. So if I were to pass it the array 2, 4, 2, 1, this method would return true. If I passed it the array 1, 2, 5, 3, this method would return false. All right, so both of these methods are at our disposal. So now let's go ahead and take a look at what we're supposed to do in the isLatin method. All right, so down here we have this method, again, a static method, meaning it's going to be called by ArrayName.isLatin, passing it the parameter of the array. And this method is going to return true if a given two-dimensional square array, this is important, that means that the rows and columns have the same dimension, square array is a Latin square, otherwise it returns false. Now, right here, we have 3 conditions that must be met. So all of these have to be met. So the way that you want to think of this is you're going to go through the checklist and you're going to try the first one. And if the first one does not work, return false. If the second one does not work, return false. If the third one does not work, return false. Okay? So if you manage to get all the way through and all of these work, then you're going to return true. So essentially what you are going to do is you are going to see, do I have to return false? Do I have to return false? And do I have to return false? Now I know some of you have been in the habit of creating a Boolean variable and you will trip the Boolean to be true or false. In this case, as soon as you realize it's not a Latin square, just return false. There's no need to create a Boolean variable and then possibly accidentally change it to be true when it shouldn't be. Just leave the method. As soon as you know it's not a Latin square, leave the method. Again, here we are given some examples of Latin squares. So a Latin square essentially says a couple things have to happen. So first of all, the top row, the first row, row 0, has to have no duplicates. So we're going to call that helper method that's available to us, contains duplicates, and we're going to check if that first row contains duplicates is false. And if that first row has no duplicates, then we keep checking. All right, now we want to check if all of the values in the first row appear in every other row of the square. So now we are going to use this method, has all values. And so we are going to see if has all values is going to return true for row 0 with every single row in our array. And if any of them don't work, we return false and leave the method. However, if that case is still met, we continue on to the last case. And the last case says if every row of the square appears in every column of the square. So now we are going to check that against every single column. And again, if any column fails, we bail, return false. Otherwise, if all three of those checks have worked, then we would return true. So we want to make sure that we're reading through these examples that are not squares because they help us to understand when our code does not work. And then it's really common for the AP to remind you of the code that's available to you, reminding you that these are all static methods, reminding you of how these methods are being called. Pay close attention to when the method accepts a two-dimensional array versus when the method accepts single-dimensional arrays. All right, so let's go ahead and let's take a look at the solution on the next page. Okay, so what you'll see here is I put a small little view of that checklist that we talked about in the problem, just to remind you of those three scenarios that we needed to check for. And then I included the solution that the AP provided. Again, we know my handwriting is not the best, so to do what's best for everybody, I just took this type solution here. So the first thing that we are checking for is this first step. The first row has no duplicate values. So we are saying if contains duplicates for square 0. So square of 0, this right here is passing the first row of the 2D array. So since the 2D array has 2 rows to it, when I just say square bracket 0, that's accessing the entire first row of the array. Okay, so I'm sending that whole row there. Now remember we talked about how if our method returns a Boolean, we don't have to say equals equals true, equals equals false. We can just say if contains duplicates square 0. So what this is telling us here is if this method returns a true, meaning that this method has duplicates, which we don't want, we return false and we bail. However, if there are no duplicates, which is what we do want, then we're going to continue on. All right, so now we get to the second step. And the second step is all values in the first row appear in each row of the square. So now what we're doing here is we are doing a for loop. Now you'll notice that the for loop starts on row 1. And it starts on row 1 because, well, there's no reason to compare row 0 with row 0. If I were to have a row that was, for example, 1, 2, 3, 3, 2, 1, and, 1, 2, 3. So first of all, this is not, well, we'll just get through it. What I'm doing here is I'm going to be comparing this row right here with this row right here. That's what I'm doing on the first iteration of the for loop. And I'm calling this helper method has all values. By putting that not symbol in front of it, I'm basically saying if every entry in row 0 and every entry in row 1. So if every entry that's here is in here, so this method is going to return true if those two rows have all the same values. If that method returns false, then that means that they don't have the same values. And so basically what this is saying by not has all values, and the reason why I want you to get comfortable with this notation is because all of the AP solutions write their solutions like this. So the sooner you get comfortable with this notation, the easier it will be for you to self-check your own work. So basically this is saying if this were a false statement, they did not have all values, and we make our not of a false, that would be true, then we return false. So another way you could think of it is if we don't have all values. So that's how I would suggest you read that. If we don't have all values. When you see that not, just replace that with the word don't. So if we don't have all values, then we return false and we bail. And we do that for every single row in the array. Now, let's say we successfully pass that check. We go on to the third test of a Latin square. And the third test of a Latin square wants us now to compare all the columns. Now, when we were comparing rows, we had to start at row 1 because row 0 was the comparison. Well, with columns, we have to check all columns. So now we're going to go ahead and we will, if I erase this, now what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be comparing this against column 0. and then column 1, and then column 2, and so forth. But every single time it's still comparing it against that first row 0. So that's why we see square 0. That's my row 0. And then this part here, this is where I am using the method that we wrote in part A. Now, some of you might have chosen to make this a separate line of code above. You might have said like that we had an array and we would call getColumn, and then once we got that array, we would pass that array here as a parameter. You can totally do that. That is not wrong. It's just an unnecessary step. And again, we will often notice in our AP solutions that they will write the most concise solutions possible. And one of the nice things about reading these solutions is it can help you to write more concise code. So notice that the column that we are comparing, since that is what is changing each iteration of our for loop, that's why we see a variable here. However, square 0, we're always comparing it against row 0. So this is where I'm comparing every single column in my array to see if it matches the first row. And in this case that I wrote, this array is not a Latin square. And we would see here on column 1 that this would fail because 221 does not contain all values. It does not contain the 3. So again, when we take a look and read this, it does not have all values. So it would return false and it would leave the method. And if I had written a valid Latin square, then this section would also pass, and then once I get down to here at this point, I've completed check 1, check 2, check 3, and now I return true. All right, if we were to go ahead and take a look at the scoring breakdown for this AP problem, we would see the following chart. And we would see that this part of the problem is worth 5 points. And we can see what's going on here. So first of all, I want you to notice that you have to call these methods. You have to call contains duplicates. You have to call has all values. You have to call it correctly without a bounds error. You have to call getColumn. And then you have to make sure that you return true properly. Okay, it's super important that you're calling these methods. They wrap the point values into calling these methods. So if you don't call the methods, even if you wrote all of the code to perfectly do that work and you wrote these like crazy for loops, it doesn't matter. You didn't call the method, you don't get the point, which is pretty harsh considering that you did actually more work. Okay, but this goes under the mindset of you want to work smarter, not harder, and good programmers use the tools that are in front of them. All right, you guys, so I took a lot of time walking through how to think through and work through those two problems, and so now it's up to you guys. I've got some problems for you to work on this week. I picked out 2 different problems for you to try this week, and then we're going to type out the code in Replit using their preset code bank, so that way you can type out your solution and then compile it and see how you did. All right, thanks. Hope everyone's staying safe out there. I miss you guys so much. Have a great day.